My son, my daughter, and I all have something called P10 hamartoma tumor syndrome. It's also known as Cowden syndrome. It's a genetic disorder where one of our P10 genes, because everyone has two sets, there's something wrong with it. For us, we have a part that's inverted. So what that means is we have a higher risk of neurodevelopmental disorders, things like autism, ADHD, intellectual disability. We also have a much higher risk of certain types of cancers and benign tumors as well throughout our bodies. So yeah, that's Cowden syndrome. My son's my oldest, he's 15. He was born prematurely with an odd combination of symptoms. He was born at a pretty high birth weight, which was abnormal because he was early. He was 5 pounds at 30 weeks, which is quite large, and disproportionately, his head was disproportionate for the rest of his body. It was much larger than it should have been. So, and his muscle tone was very weak, which is common among our population. We didn't know that at the time, but that basically in the NICU, where they send premature children, they threw every genetic test at him because they were pretty sure that was the cause. And because those things can take a lot of time, we actually didn't have a label for almost 2 years. It took this test, nope, that's negative. This test, nope, that's negative. This test, nope, that's negative. Then finally, we had something called a microarray, or he had something that was called a microarray, where they look at all of your genes, but in a very non-detailed, non-specific kind of way. And they're able to see certain defects, and that's where they found his. And because it's much more likely that it came from one of his parents, they brought my husband and I in for genetic counseling and said, okay, let's talk about your family history. My family history was much more significant for testing, and it turned out that I was actually the cause of it. I had the same gene mutation that he did, which means that we both have the same syndrome, but it presents wildly differently in people across our population. Some are very, very affected with regards to cognitive difficulties, and some are not. Some have a more significant history for certain types of cancers or tumor growths. Some don't. They're still trying to determine if the place of the mutation or the type of the mutation, that kind of thing, is related to what the overall outcome is. But it's very wide across what it could be when you have that diagnosis. We knew pretty much right away that it was probably me that it came from, just because there's so much cancer and developmental disabilities within my family that, well, it's theoretically possible that it happened spontaneously. It's much more likely it came from me. So I immediately started telling my family, because they all have, or a good amount of them had children of their own at that point. And, you know, it's important to watch for those types of things so that you can be treated right away, and you can have a heightened level of surveillance. And I was kind of alone in that thought. Almost no one wanted to be tested. So I don't know. I mean, it never occurred to me to not tell our story. If you have the ability to see what awful things can happen to you or to your your children in the future, things that they're going to struggle with, things that you might struggle with. There's a lot of power in that knowledge. And I don't understand why somebody wouldn't take that opportunity to get that test, to get hooked up with those doctors and to start that surveillance so that you don't find yourself with cancer or with some chronic issue that you could have avoided. That's the Cowden's also has some thyroid difficulties as well. My thyroid is really messed up, so I'm on medication for it for the rest of my life. But living with the symptoms that could be alleviated with medication just doesn't make sense to me. So when we were presented with the option of, tell everybody so that they can make those educated choices and they can do what's best for them, it didn't occur to me that nobody would want that test. But that's what wound up happening. So I made the choice as, my kid's parent to get them the test and get them hooked up with the specialist to be followed. And now we're part of clinical and research trials so that the medical field can actually learn from us and study, our outcomes over time. Because otherwise, what's going to happen is more people are going to get what we got. When I got my son's diagnosis, it was literally, we know this isn't right, but we have no idea what it means. We waited 2 years to hear, we know this isn't right, we know this isn't normal, but we don't know what it means. Our community is really small. There's only a couple thousand people with our diagnosis in the United States. And so that makes learning and studying from and treatments and things like this very, very challenging. So because there's 3 of us in my family, we tend to get called a lot for studies because, well, and like I said, it's the way this expresses in different people can be pretty wide, and that's depicted within my family. Each of myself and my children all struggle with different things. Personally, my memory, not great. I have to do things like set alarms on my phone and put Post-it notes up to remind me to do certain things. Working memory is not awesome. But that led us to the clinical trial, where that's a common theme. So the clinical trial was repurposing another medication for a similar disorder to see if it helped us as well. So it was only supposed to be 6 months, but the COVID broke out right in the middle of the clinical trial. And the medication was an immunosuppressant. So when COVID hit and we didn't have answers and everything kind of shut down, that was a really scary situation. Thankfully, none of us got sick. We had the ability to stay home and stay pretty isolated until we got guidance from the doctors. But yeah, that was a really scary situation. We're all off the medication now, and it's going through the process with the FDA. But knowing that is the only viable treatment at this point for some of the neurocognitive difficulties in our population, and knowing that being on that medication in the middle of a worldwide pandemic, stress doesn't quite capture that. It was an interesting experience. Getting a diagnosis of a genetic syndrome or a genetic condition that no one is studying because incredibly rare, that there are no treatments available because there's a minute population. It's devastating. And as devastating as it is, you can't move forward if you don't volunteer your family, volunteer yourself to be the person that the medical community learns from. Otherwise, things don't get better. And, you know, even the first time we heard this diagnosis was 13 years ago. And like I said, we knew almost nothing. Now we have pretty reliable calculated risks for cancer and for neurodevelopmental disorders. And there's a possibility of a medication that actually improved all three of us pretty remarkably being on the market in the next few years. But you have to tell your story to get there. You have to be willing to make the travel to the people that are studying and the people that want to learn from. It's a huge time commitment. I'm not going to lie. But the benefits that you can get out of it, the potential to learn more about yourself and about your family, I can't overstate how much power is in knowledge. And then you can make better choices for your children, for yourself, for your future. Gotten the diagnosis, maybe it's common. If it's a common thing, like Down syndrome, just an example, there's lots of national or local chapters where you can connect with and start talking to people that are a bit more experienced, people that might have projects or supports in the community that you can get involved with, and start advocacy even at your local level. If it's something more rare, thankfully, social media helps bridge that gap. I spend a good amount of time in a variety of Facebook groups connected to our condition because it joins us into our own little world where we can say things like, yeah, I'm sorry that the care that you're getting where you are isn't great. It's likely not because your providers are trying to not be helpful. It's because they probably did not get any education on your condition at all. Or it was a paragraph or an extra credit question in med school. These are the university centers, and that's the other thing. If you have a rare disorder, you should start with university centers because they are much more on top of research than your local physician, even if it means you have to travel. I can't tell you the difference between going to a regular pediatrician who is wonderful, but going to a pediatrician connected to a research center. It's the difference between them asking you questions about your condition and you getting answers from an educated professional. Find your community, ultimately. You know, if your community is online, great. If you have to travel like we do to a larger research center, then, you know, it's unfortunate and it is so expensive. But it makes a difference. It really does. It's so frustrating to know there's something wrong, and for your providers to know there's something wrong, but to not have any idea what to do about it. Community can be someone or people that have the same condition or diagnosis that you do, but it can also be in a broader sense. You know, the folks that all have a P10 disorder, they're great in that, you know, they have recommendations for fantastic doctors that you don't have to go through the whole history with. But sometimes your community doesn't have to match up exactly. You know, recently I got involved with our parent training center, that deals a lot with special education, and that does affect my oldest child. So knowing that you can find community in lots of places, where do you feel like you need the help? If you've got a fantastic medical team, maybe you want to start working within the special education community, if that's something that affects you. Or if that's not, maybe you want to start working, maybe you want to send a letter to your representatives and say, this is what's affecting me. It wound up, I kind of dabbled in a few different communities. It wound up that I needed to do that in a few situations. One of the physical symptoms of our condition is a larger than average head size, both in height and in width. And a good part of the time that my son was in school in his younger years, he was bullied pretty relentlessly. More often called things like an alien because of the size and the shape of his head. And policies surrounding harassment, intimidation, and bullying were focused more on race and on whether someone was in a wheelchair kind of things. And so allowing that to continue and not calling it what it was for a number of years, I started to focus more within the school system, and had those changes made to that policy to include people with what they consider invisible disabilities, so that they don't have to go through the same trauma that my kid did, because it is trauma. It's really unfortunate when you go to a place that should be safe, like school, and it's made to feel very unsafe. The whole thing is super complicated. But yeah, that's the journey. Always learning.